It was about 4 or 6 weeks ago. I actually purchased something that really made me feel like an adult. In fact, more than that, it made me feel like a man. I bought a recliner. What's more manly than buying a recliner? And I just turned 40 in February, and this is the first time in my life I've actually owned a recliner. And we've had a couch and love seat before that the ends of them recline, but there's something different about actually having a recliner, and it's just wonderful. I don't know if it is that God made me for the recliner or He made the recliner for me, but in either case, I view it to be heaven sent, and it's wonderfully comfortable to sit in that chair, and of course I know it, and Caroline knows it, the whole family knows it, but because Caroline is pregnant, if she wants to sit in the chair, well then that recliner becomes the Queen's throne, and so I understand that. That's one of the perks of being pregnant, but outside of her, if Daddy wants to sit in the chair, Daddy sits in the chair. Now, the kids understand, and they're aware that this recliner is very comfortable as well. And so I can't count the number of times over the past 4 to 6 weeks that I have gone into the den with intent on sitting down, and I'll notice a child seated in the chair. Nay, nay, nay. But I don't say anything. This is all I do. I don't open my mouth. And they get up and walk away. I mean, who says parenting has no perks, right? But it didn't start off that way. I mean, the first time that I did that, they said, "Why do I have to move?" And the answer was very simple: because I said so. Because I said so. I mean, how many times do you as parents give that as the answer? I mean, that's a great catch-all for a lot of things that kids ask. It's one of the perks of being able to be a parent is to be able to use that phrase, because so many times throughout the course of any given day or week, there's going to be things that your child says, "I want to do this," and you say no. They say, "Why?" "Well, because I said so." You tell them, "I want you to do this." They say, "Why?" "Well, because I said so." Because I said so. Hold that thought for a moment. If you're here this morning, I hope that one of the reasons is because you've got a personal relationship with Christ, that you know Him in a real and a personal way, that you would say and do so without equivocation, "I'm a Christian, and I'm here today to worship because I'm a Christian." Now, if you have yet to make that decision or yet to come to that experience, my hope is that today that you do make that decision. But if you're here today as a follower of Christ, if you're here today as a Christian, you are here today, again, as a follower of Christ. What does it mean to be a follower of someone? Well, it means that they are the one who is in charge. They are charting the course. They are directing the route. They're establishing the parameters. They're marking the boundaries, and they're saying this is the way that you go, and all of these other ways are not. If we're here today as a follower of Christ, it means that He is our leader and we are following Him. But the question is, what gives Him the right to do that? What gives Him the ability to say you should do this and not that? What gives Him the reasonable expectation for Him to tell us or to guide us to do something and we actually do it? You know, it would be sufficient for Him to say, "Well, because I said so." But thankfully He's given us more reason than that. Why exactly is it that we follow? Why exactly is it that we listen? Why exactly is it that we obey? We see the answer to that question today in Colossians chapter 1. If you would look with me in your Bibles, we're going to start reading today with verse 15, continuing to make our way through this little letter that Paul wrote to these believers in the city of Colossae in a series that I've entitled Rooted and Build Up. Colossians chapter 1, starting with verse 15. Paul says of Jesus, verse 15 of Colossians 1, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through Him and for Him. He's before all things, and in Him all things consist. He's the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things He may have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in Him all the fullness should dwell, and by Him to reconcile all things to Himself, by Him, whether things on the earth or in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Having made peace through the blood of his cross. Again, the question is, as a follower of Christ, why in the world are we actually following? Well, it's because he said so, but it's even more than that. And Paul gives us a couple of reasons, and the first is this: because Jesus made it all. Why do we follow Jesus? Because Jesus made it all. Now, this passage comprises what is described as one of the high water marks, or one of the most consequential, Christological passages in all the New Testament. What does Christological mean? It means that it's a passage that communicates to us the doctrines that we believe about Jesus. And Paul is communicating here a lot of ideas that form the foundation for what it is that we believe about Jesus, who he is, how he operates, what the nature of his power is, what his actual identity is. This is a significant passage. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that Paul is seeking to underscore this fact that when we speak of Jesus, we are speaking of deity. We're not speaking of an elevated individual, a lofty teacher, a great example. When we speak of Jesus, we're speaking of deity. We are speaking of God. And out of the gate, he starts in verse 15 by saying that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Now, that's not a very long sentence, but it's a sentence loaded with some theological depth. And it is also a verse that has formed the bedrock for a lot of bad doctrine and, quite frankly, a fair amount of heresy over the course of Christian history. So that we understand and deal with this correctly, think again what Paul says. He says of Jesus that he is the image of the invisible God. Throughout the course of Christian history, there are those that have used this verse to say, see, that goes to show us. When we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about someone special, but someone that's not God. He's the image. He's kind of like the symbol, kind of like the logo for God, but not actually God. He's kind of the image of the invisible God. Well, not only does that interpretation rob Jesus of his deity, not only does that interpretation maintain inconsistency with the rest of the New Testament, it also doesn't take seriously what Paul actually says. Because when he says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the word that's translated there as image literally means manifestation or visible expression. In short, what he's trying to communicate is that when Jesus, who always has existed, as God has always existed, but when Jesus came into this world, he took on a body. He became God incarnate, and as such, he became the one that is visible to us. He became the visible expression of God. He became God who is visible to us. Beyond that, he says at the end of verse 15 that Jesus is the firstborn over all creation. Now, this in particular is a statement that has caused a fair amount of controversy over the years, generated a fair amount of bad and even heretical doctrine. Some have suggested, well, see, what Paul is communicating there again is that Jesus is somehow less than, not quite God. In fact, there are those that say that Jesus, when he's talking about firstborn and talks about creation, that's Paul trying to say that Jesus is the apex of God's creation, that everything else is good, but Jesus was the best thing that God ever made, the apex of creation. Now, that was discounted as heresy in the 3rd century, but it still exists today. You've probably had Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on your door, and that's exactly what they teach, that Jesus is the firstborn of creation. He's the first thing that God created. Greater than us, but somehow less than God. Well, that was discounted as heresy in the 3rd century and should still be discounted as heresy in the 21st century because it is a lie. It robs Jesus of his deity, and Paul is trying to make very plain, when we speak of Jesus, we are speaking of God. Well, what does that firstborn over creation mean? Well, when he uses the phrase firstborn, this, especially in the 1st century, was something that they understood. And if you've got a decent understanding of the Old Testament, it should ring some bells. Because you recall, especially in the Old Testament culture, you had a father who would have sons, and the eldest son, the firstborn, there was a ritual where they would go through where he would be given his birthright, and he was given a place of prominence, a place of preeminence in the family. What is Paul saying about Jesus related to creation? That he is in the place of preeminence above it all. Now, he's not saying at all that Jesus is created. Rather, he says in verse 17, he is before all, at the end of verse 16, all things were created through him and for him. Is Jesus created? No. Jesus, Paul says, is creator. All things were created through him. John puts it this way in John chapter 1, verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that is made. Paul's point is, if you can see it, Jesus made it. Notice verse 16. All things were created that are in heaven and on the earth, visible and invisible. If you can see it, Jesus made it. But he goes further to say, even if you cannot see it, if it's something intangible, if it's a principality or power, Jesus made that. If it's something that exists in our sphere of living here on the earth, Jesus made it. But he goes even further to say, even if you can't see it because it's in heaven, Jesus made that. Whether it is tangible or intangible, he's saying that Jesus is the one who made it all. All things were created through him. But then he says all things were created for him. We follow him because he made it all, and the one who made it all created it for him. Now, for him communicates the idea of for his enjoyment, for his experience. But it also, I think, connotates another idea. When I was in elementary school, I was a Cub Scout, and we would meet one afternoon after school each day of the week. And among the things that we would do on a regular basis is to have some type of craft. And I remember one day our scout leader brought in this big old blob of modeling clay. And I think Father's Day or something was coming up, but what we were to do is to take this clay and make something out of it for our dads to give as a gift. And so we each get this blob, and we can make anything that we want to. If you want to make a figurine, if you want to make some whatever, it's completely up to you. And so I start off with all these grand ideas, but then I realize I'm effectively working with mittens, and I don't have the ability to make something that's kind of nice. And so I keep working, and finally I decide, oh, I can make this. This will be the perfect gift. I'll give my dad, I'll make for him an ashtray. My dad doesn't smoke, but, he needs an ashtray, right? I mean, don't we all? And so, ashtrays are pretty easy to make, and so I was able to do that. And after I'd done that, I painted his initials in it. And so, come gift-giving time, I'm just so excited to give my father this ashtray to a man, again, who does not smoke. And thankfully, though, he did not laugh or scoff or belittle my gift whatsoever, but he was grateful to receive this. And he didn't throw it away. He didn't say, well, I don't smoke, I don't need this. What he did was to put it on his dresser. Now, in terms of actual usefulness, he didn't use it for cigarette butts. He would put his coins or keys or something like that in there. But for years and years and years, my dad kept this on his dresser. Why? Because every time he saw it, it did what? It reminded him of the one who made it. When Paul speaks of everything that exists having been made through and by Jesus, not only does that communicate the idea that all that exists is for his pleasure and for his goodwill, but all that has been made, all those who are created, are able to also recognize this and honor the one who made it. Listen, why is it that we follow Jesus? Because he made it all. One of the perks of being the creator is that all that exists in creation is inferior to you. That's what Paul's trying to communicate. Why do we follow? Yeah, because he says things, and we should do so because he says so. But beyond that, he made it all. That's one reason, but it communicates a second reason. Not only did Jesus make it all, but he says of Jesus that he reconciles it all. Why do we follow him? Because he reconciles it all. In verse 19, Paul says, it pleased the Father that in him, that's Jesus, all the fullness, that's the fullness of God, should dwell. If there is any doubt as to whether Paul is questionable about the deity of Jesus, verse 19 should answer this. Because he's saying of Jesus, as God in flesh, you have the fullness of deity. You have all the power, you have all the knowledge, you have all the wisdom, you have everything that is God is in Jesus, because Jesus is God. And as God, he's made everything, but verse 20 says, the one who has made everything is seeking to do something with everything that he has made. Well, what's that? Well, to reconcile it. to reconcile it. Well, we use the term reconcile, not necessarily on a daily basis, but we do use that term periodically. Sometimes we use it in accounting to say I'm going to reconcile what my register says with what the bank statement says. So I'm going to reconcile those. But generally speaking, we use the term to convey the idea of reconciling in terms of relationship. It's pretty clear that that's what Paul is talking about here, because he, at the end of that verse, talks about having made peace. But really, for this whole idea of reconciling to make sense, you've got to step back for just a second and go back to what we talked about first. Jesus made everything. Pretty simple thought. If you can see it, He made it. If you can't see it, He made it. If it's spiritual in nature, He made it. If it's tangible in nature, He made it. Everything that exists, He made it. Once you get that thought, you understand the second thought, which is this: sin affected everything He made. Sin has affected everything He made. Now, the first example we get of this actually precedes the creation itself, and that was when God made the angels. God made the angels as absolutely perfect beings, but you recall what happened. Lucifer decided, you know what? I could run this place. I should be in charge. And so Lucifer rebels against God. A third of the angels decide, you know what, well, I want to follow him. And so Satan is cast out. Lucifer is cast out of heaven, and a full third of the angels cast out with him. Sin messed all of that up. But then God created the world. Everything that we know that exists, Jesus made this. And then Adam and Eve ate of that forbidden fruit, and it affected everything. It messed up everything. Now, it's easy to see that relative to us as people, relative to us as physical beings, because once sin came into the world, the first thing that happened is that the clock started to tick. We had a lifespan, and death became a reality for us. Well, death became a reality due in part because disease began to be experienced by us. Knees and hips start to wear out, and eyes begin to dim, and hearing begins to diminish. And the effects of aging take their toll on our bodies until they just wear out and stop. But beyond that, Genesis describes that childbirthing became a painful experience because of sin. This was not originally the plan of God, but because sin came in the world, childbirthing became a painful experience. It affected us physically. It affected our bodies, but Genesis tells us that it didn't merely affect humankind. It affected the entire sphere of existence for humankind. It affected everything in the world itself. Genesis tells us that all of a sudden thorns and thistles and briars began to appear. My guess is that's about the time that poison ivy and poison oak showed up. Beyond that, the ground became less than fertile, became difficult to plow. Pestilence and droughts and floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and all of these things that we view as natural disasters, all of a sudden that began to be a part of the human experience. Why? Because the one who made everything had everything that he made messed up by sin. Now, I get the fact, and I understand, and you can attest to this as well, there are some really good days that we experience where we're happy and we feel well and the weather's great, but I'm telling you, the best day that you have, the day that you are just so thankful to God just plain to be alive, that best day is but a shadow of what God originally intended for things to be. Sin messed up everything in our bodies, messed up everything in the world, even messed things up in heaven with the fallen angels. It messed up everything. So the one who made everything, again, Paul says, is doing something about it, and that is that he is reconciling them. Now, again, we talked about just a moment ago that reconciling here has something to do, at least in terms of Paul's usage, with reconciling in the area of relationship. We understand that because he uses the word peace. Reconciling, bringing about peace through the blood of his cross. Now, what exactly does peace mean? You know, some would say, and the definition of peace for them would be, it's the absence of conflict. It means that there's no war going on. But hopefully you recognize that there can be an absence of tangible expressions of conflict and hostility. There can be an absence of war when what is experienced is somehow less than what we'd call peace. You understand that if you're married. Think with me about this. You've got a husband or a wife that does something that aggravates the other. Actually, let's get more specific. The husband does something that aggravates the wife, because that's how it works. Right, ladies? Yes. See those hands. All right. So the husband does something that aggravates or is off-putting to the wife. Strangely, I have done that. It was one time. It's a little vague. No. It has happened repeated occasions in our close to 11 years of marriage. And I'll give you an example. Let's say Caroline has asked me something, and I respond to her question or to her statement. Sometimes I can tell, not because she says something, but because of her nonverbals, she didn't like my answer. She thought perhaps, and I can tell by her response, that she thought my response was either curt or mean or short or ill-tempered. She doesn't have to say it. I can tell by how she's responding, she thinks I responded in an inappropriate way. And even though I know that, I start thinking in my mind, I didn't say it mean. I didn't intend it mean. There was no ill will in my mind, none in my heart. You know what? She's ticked about that. I'm just going to let this ride because I haven't done anything wrong. Any of you been there? Any of you there right now? So I say to myself, I'm just going to let this ride. Now, at that point, it's not that Caroline is completely giving me the silent treatment. It's just that she's not saying much. And so words that she shares with me are only essential in nature. And there's no obvious signs of conflict. We're not fussing at each other. We're not yelling at each other. We're not throwing things. There's no visible signs of conflict, but what we are experiencing in those times, I wouldn't really put it in the peace category. The one who made everything has had everything affected by sin. There are lots of folks that may say, whether they're in the church or outside the church, part of the faith or not, I don't feel like I'm necessarily at war with God. I'm not waving my fist towards heaven, and it's not like I'm dodging lightning bolts as He's trying to get me. It doesn't feel like there is a war going on, but what is experienced is somehow less than peace. Things aren't okay. Things are not right. There's separation that exists. Paul is saying the one who made it all has had everything, including me, including you, affected by sin. But the one who made it all is seeking to do something with it all, and that is to make it right, to reconcile it, to actually bring about peace. Now, for things to get okay and for Caroline and I to get reconciled, something has to happen. One of us has to take the initiative, and the same is true between us and God. For things to change, something's got to happen. And Paul tells us what that is in verse 20, that He's made peace through the blood of His cross. Jesus took the initiative. He came and endured the cross. It's a simple thought, but you need to understand this. When sin occurs, punishment must also occur. For things to be made right, for there to be reconciliation, punishment for that wrong must occur. What Paul is saying is that Jesus in love took your punishment. If any person comes to be reconciled to God, if we get to the point where things are not just tolerable, but things are good, things are okay between we and the one who made us, well, it's because we come to accept what Jesus did on the cross. That makes Him worth following. makes it worth us doing what He says, because He's reconciling everything, not just us. In fact, the New Testament paints the picture that the big plan of God does not merely involve reconciling us, but even the entire created order. Paradise lost will one day become paradise restored. It makes Him worth following because the truth is He didn't have to do that. Do you get that fact? That the one who made it all had it messed up by us. And He could have so easily just brushed His hands and said, fine, have it your way. Here's the consequences. Take that. But He didn't. In fact, what He did was to say, I'll take those consequences so that I could be right, so that you could be right with Him. That gives Him the right to lead. It gives us the reason to follow. And this morning it gives us occasion to remember what made all this possible. Paul says that this reconciliation occurs because of one simple reason: His blood on our cross. And through symbols, we want to honor and remember that sacrifice today. Will you bow your heads with me? I want to just first ask you a simple question. Hopefully you recognize that this enduring the cross, accepting a punishment that He did not deserve, that's something that Jesus did, something that He did for you. Because things between you and Him were not right. Things weren't okay. And what He wants to do is to establish peace. He made it possible. But have you ever experienced that? Can you say, not simply, Michael, I know that I've got that, but can you say before the Lord, Lord, thank you, I know that I've got that. Listen, if you can't, we're going to have a time of decision where you can respond. What I'd ask you to do is just to leave where you are and come share that with me. Let me pray with you. Let me begin a conversation so that you can come to know and experience what so many of us already have. That we've been able to be reconciled to the one who made us, who made everything. Maybe there's another decision that God's calling you to make. Perhaps it's to become a part of this church family. Maybe there's a burden on your heart that you just want to share. Maybe you want to do it in your pew, or you just want to kneel at this altar. This time is for you as well. But this morning, we can say that Jesus is absolutely worth following because He made it all and He reconciled it all. Reconciliation was made possible through His blood on the cross. This morning, through symbols, we're going to remember and to reflect and to honor that sacrifice. This is not a pattern or plan that we dreamt up on our own. It's a pattern that Jesus Himself gave for us, so that through symbols we could remember what He endured in His body. So that through symbols we could remember that it was His blood shed that made all of this possible. As we do that, we need to do so, what Paul says, in a worthy manner. That means that we're clean, that we have an honest conversation with God. As Karen softly plays this morning, I want you to have that conversation with God. Come clean before Him. Thank Him for what He did for you. Thank Him that reconciliation is made possible because He took the initiative for you. As she plays, you pray. As she plays, if you need to make a decision, you want someone to pray with you, you come.